There's no denying that the protagonist is the most important character of your story. They're the reason the story exists. However, if you think of your favorite books and movies, TV shows, web series, whatever it is, I'm sure they're your favorite, not just because of the protagonist, but because of the entire cast of characters and how they interact with each other. Maybe there's a really interesting and compelling villain that you're not supposed to like, but you can't help but kind of root for them, or you know that they're so evil, but you understand why they're doing something. Or there's just that friend that is just like the funniest, best character you've ever seen in your life, or a mentor character that teaches you something about how to live your life, or anything like that. What makes great storytelling great is having an entire cast of characters who speak to your audience in different ways. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about how to create characters that feel developed and real, even if you don't have endless amounts of time to explore who they are and develop them in the same way that you do your protagonist. Hi, hello, how are you? I hope you're having an amazing day. My name is Maddie Bloom, and I'm a multi-genre author working on my sophomore novel, and this is Writing Craft Chat Episode 2, and this is a series where I talk about writing craft and how to improve and grow, because we should always be lifelong students no matter how experienced we get. So welcome to creating a cast of developed characters. I wanted to talk about this concept because I feel like there's so much wonderful and amazing content about building your protagonist. And that information is so necessary because, again, of course, our protagonist is our point of view character. They're who we go on the journey with. They're who we see change the most and who has that drive to carry the story forward. However, having those backup characters and other major players on the board feeling real and just as lifelike as your protagonist makes your story richer, it feels more developed, and in my opinion, it makes for a story that either won't leave my head or it's one that I'm going to go back to over and over again. When I'm reading for younger writers or people who are newer in the craft, I come across this sometimes where it feels like the world bends around the protagonist. And I've noticed that sometimes the characters tend to fall in one of two categories. The first is where they exist to uplift and help the protagonist, and none of their personal desires are ever put above the protagonist desires. And then the second group is the character only exists as an obstacle to the protagonist. So again, their personal desires don't really exist, and in fact, their only desire is to stop the protagonist. This makes for a story that feels a little wooden and a little flat, no matter how amazing your protagonist has been developed or the arc you've created for them, because it's just a little unnatural. And even though your protagonist is the main character of that story, they probably aren't necessarily the main character of that story world, because we're kind of all the main characters in our own lives. So having characters who feel like in their own life they're the main character just makes your story a lot more compelling. And before we get any deeper, I will always iterate that writing is a skill, which means it can be improved upon and developed. And chances are, if you clicked on this video, you're worried that your side characters, your antagonist, your love interest, whatever, might feel a little flat, and that is totally okay. I've been there before as well, and sometimes when I'm reading early drafts, I just have to take a minute to reassess where my characters are and develop them a little bit more. The great thing about writing is that you just have to get something on the paper and then you can edit it and make it better. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. For this video, I am going to be referencing John Truby's The Anatomy of Story. This is the holy grail of writing reference books, and I think every writer should read this book. And also, it is like the superior floppy book. Like, you can open it to the page you want, and then it just flops and stays open. Like, this is a superior book as a physical product, and then all of the information in here is top tier. John Truby taught the writers that would go on to write Shrek, which I feel like is What more do you need to convince you? But yes, I highly recommend The Anatomy of Story. It is so succinct and everything in it is so helpful to grow as a writer. And also, I like when things are pointed out in a way that I can spot them in other books and movies, because I think I learn best kind of pointing things out and mapping things together and then being able to apply it to my own work. And since we need an example, I'm going to be using Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. I love using like children's and family movies as examples just because it's something that a lot of people have seen, and so you already have an understanding of it. And if you haven't, a movie is a low stakes commitment, while a book is, a little bit more. It just takes longer, so that way you can have all the information. Because some of these examples that John Truby uses, they're for movies I've like never seen before in my life. So I want to use something that has a pretty wide appeal, so you can kind of see how these elements are being used. The other great thing about storytelling for younger audiences is that it is shown a little bit more straightforward and simply, which is not to say that those projects are easier to write, but it's just easier to decipher and point out, so you can see exactly how these elements are being used and how these structures are put into place, so you can apply that to your own writing. And Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is such an incredible movie and story, and I know I'm not at the level where I could have written that, so of course I want to learn from it. And if I may, just another, before we get into the meat of this story, to talk about the movie, because I remember The Last Wish came out around the same time as Thor: Love and Thunder, which was another Wish movie. And you can't even compare them because Thor sucked so bad, it wasn't funny, like the jokes didn't land, and then I just thought The Wish was done just so poorly, and I can't even remember how it ended, but it just didn't have any emotional impact. And Christian Bale was one of those villains where he's kind of right, so they have to make him do this super evil thing to make him seem evil and bad and blah blah blah. So yeah, I was really disenchanted with the Thor movie, and then I saw Puss in Boots and I was blown out of the water because I was not expecting this from a sequel to a spin-off series. And speaking of the power of characters, Puss in Boots was a side character in Shrek 2 and then the subsequent movies. So having developed characters can really open up worlds for you as a writer. So with that tangent over, let's get into character building. As we know, with your protagonist as your point of view character, so they are who we're going on the journey with, and of course that means they need a desire, a want, a need, an arc. The conflict kind of revolves around them and their journey, but that is not to say that your other major characters cannot also have arcs, wants, and needs. For The Last Wish, and this might be controversial, for The Last Wish, I would say the three main characters is Puss in Boots, of course, he's our protagonist, and then we have Kitty Softpaws, who I would say is the main antagonist. And then we have Goldilocks, who is a side antagonist, but she's also the subplot character. So she's mirroring Puss's journey, but it's showing it in a different way. And they have very similar arcs of desiring the wish for themselves, and then over the course learning that they already have everything they need to be happy and they don't need the wish. So even though there's one protagonist, we have multiple characters that have that same setup of want, need, and the journey that they go on to get there. Of course, all of your characters need a personality to distinguish themselves as an individual, but what they really truly need is a function. Every single character in your story needs a reason to be there. And according to John Truby, all of your characters should be interconnected into one character web. So don't think of your characters as separate individuals. To quote John Truby, "A character is often defined by who he is not. Each time you compare a character to your hero, you force yourself to distinguish the hero in new ways. You also start to see the secondary characters as complete human beings, as complex and as valuable as your hero. All characters connect and define each other in 4 major ways: by story function, archetype, theme, and opposition. So according to John Truby, these are the main character functions that all major characters should fall under. Of course, if you have like a character that's just around for one scene to advance the story forward, you're okay. You have your hero, your opponent, and in a love story, your main opponent is your love interest. Ally, fake ally opponent, fake opponent ally, and then your subplot character. And then your characters have to fall into one of these different archetypes that I will leave listed here because I don't want to go through and say all of them. Finally, you get to theme and opposition. So theme is what you are saying with your story. You need to say something, and that is why theme cannot be a vague concept like justice. You have to say what you believe justice is. So if you are doing like a courtroom drama, then you're probably going to be saying something about whether you think, there is an inherent issue in the system, or if you think the system wins. Whatever you have to say, you use your characters to say it. For the last wish, the theme is that you don't need a wish to get what you want. And in fact, you probably already have it. Of course, this theme is played out through the various characters. Puss, Kitty Softballs, and Goldie learn that they don't need a wish to be happy and to live the life that they desire. Perito always knew that, and in fact, he said that to Puss, which is an also important aspect of storytelling, but we're not talking about that today. Mama Bear tells Goldie that she is a part of the family before Goldie comes to that realization herself. And the one character that doesn't learn this is Jack Horner, but of course he's punished, he's dead by the end of the film. So everything that the characters do, learn or don't learn, reaffirms this theme. And over the journey of showcasing this theme and having the characters learn it or reaffirm their belief, they are in opposition to one another. Your villain is the best villain they can be when they want the same thing as your hero. So if Jack Horner had just wanted to stop Puss in Boots from getting the wish, he wouldn't have been as compelling. So even though Jack Horner, Kitty Softpaws, Goldilocks were trying to stop Puss in Boots, it's because they wanted the wish more for themselves. So they were still acting within their own personal desires and not out of this desire solely to stop Puss in Boots. Death as a character is an outlier because he's more of a metaphorical battle that Puss is fighting as a secondary plot. So, he's kind of an outlier there. But even so, he doesn't just want to kill Puss in Boots for the sake of throwing a wrench in Puss's plans. He wants to hold him accountable for the reckless way he's treated 8 lives. So there is still a personal desire that is coming into opposition with Puss's will to live. So once you kind of have those 4 aspects that John Truby recommends mapped out, that's when you can really start building them into fully developed people. And here are some of the ways that I've seen this done really well and I'm trying to implement and learn for myself. And I think one of those biggest aspects is, what do your characters desire most, and how does that influence their actions with other characters? I mentioned this earlier, but in the real world, all we have is our perception of life. So we are all the main characters in our own stories. So even though your hero might be the special, the other characters can recognize that someone has a special destiny or whatever, but they still have their own personal desires. They're still living for themselves because all they can perceive is their own perception. So you need to figure out, what does your character desire most? What are they afraid of most? And how will that influence their decisions? And oftentimes that creates a lot of natural progression for natural friction and conflict within your story. I also think it's helpful that, of course, not every character can have the full depth of your protagonist, but it helps to know a bit about their backstory, even if that doesn't show explicitly through the text. And even if you are doing a journey story, so the character's desires are mostly revolved around helping and getting this journey done, they should have some desire that is independent of the main character. Even Perito, even though he was a very innocent, kind character, he had his own desire, and his desire was to be a therapy dog. And then he implements that. He reaches that by the end of the story. In fact, he helps Puss come down from a panic attack near the middle of the story. And I think that's also really helpful when you have multiple major characters, side characters, having them reach their goals at different points throughout the story adds a lot of variety and room for dips and valleys. Apart from the overall arc of the story, that adds a lot of like excitement and variation that makes it a lot more compelling for people to enjoy. Because if you think about your life and your group of friends, you're probably not all accomplishing big accomplishments at the same exact time. So adding that change in pace helps make your characters feel more real and feel more real in their interactions with one another. And if you want to know how your characters would act in a situation or just need some help getting into their heads as you are creating this journey for your characters to go on, I highly recommend taking the Myers-Briggs personality test in the perspective of your characters. I know that it is not like you shouldn't be defining your whole entire self to this one personality test in your real life, but I find that it's very helpful to think in the mind of my character about different situations outside of the story and in a more general context. I don't write contemporary, so I don't find it very helpful to know what my character's favorite drink is. And I also don't think that like your favorite drink really says anything about you because you can justify whatever you wanted. Like if you had a broody character, then of course you could have like the stereotypical. Well, I feel like any drink at this point is stereotypical because again, like your taste in food doesn't like matter to who you are. So if you're like a broody character and you like black coffee because you're like, oh, I'm so broody, but also if they like a sweet treat, it's like seems like an antithesis to what you would assume. So I don't know. It's just like to me that doesn't mean anything because you just like what you like. Whatever. Maybe knowing if your character tries to be healthy or not, like I could see that would have more I could see that would have more weight in the story, but yeah, I don't know. Those like silly personal preference things, I don't find very helpful unless you have a character building moment where it pops up, but I digress. The Myers-Briggs test helps me a lot more because again, it's just like very general situations that may or may not pop up in my story, but knowing how they would react or if they prefer to work alone or this or that or the other, knowing how they prefer to work and how they see the world is really helpful for developing that personality and developing their interactions with the other characters within the story. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind too is that this is a lot of information, and there's a lot of information in the character chapter as well that I did not go over. So the biggest thing to remember is that you don't have to get your characters right on the first draft. And in fact, when I go back and reread my first draft, the characterization is all over the place, and that's where I spend a lot of time in the developmental edit because that first draft is just getting your idea onto paper and developing it into something more, developing it into the beginnings of a story. So you don't have to get all of this right away. This can be done over time as you're reworking scenes and as you're developing ways to connect the plot and make it a little bit stronger and sew up those plot holes, whatever. You don't have to get this right away, but just having all of this like in the back of your head while you're working is really helpful, I find, and it helps me make connections that I probably wouldn't have made without thinking about this beforehand. That is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching if you made it this far. I would love to hear your thoughts about your favorite side characters or antagonists, or how you go about creating believable side and villain characters. If you'd like to subscribe, I post writing craft chats, reading wrap-ups, and vlogs as I work on my books and things like that. Otherwise, all of my social links are down below. You can sign up for my newsletter or also look at my debut novel, This Cruel Fate, Everything is listed down below. Thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you next week.